Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
We are here to talk about big questions. Maybe the biggest question of all, does God exist? I won't give you a proof tonight, but I hope I will give you some things to think about. Things that have led me from being an atheist to becoming a believer and a follower of Jesus. And I will try to explain to you that pathway in a fairly abbreviated form, and also explain to you how I see no conflict between that perspective and that of a scientist who is rigorous in his views of data and won't allow you to put one over on me when it comes to views of nature, but who also sees that the study of nature is not all there is. So come, let us reason together here this evening and see what we might learn. And as Socrates said, let us follow the truth whithersoever it leads. And of course, veritas means truth, and I think that is very much what this forum stands for. I would like to start perhaps by telling you a little bit about the science that I've had the privilege of being involved in, which is the study of our human DNA instruction book, the human genome. And I will certainly argue that the faith and the science perspectives are appropriate to consider together. So we are going to talk about this molecule, this amazing double helix shown here spilling out of the nucleus of the cell, carrying the information that needs to be passed from parent to child, generation after generation, by the series of these chemical bases, here abbreviated A, C, G, and T. And it is the order of those letters that basically must be there in order to provide the instructions to take each organism from its original rather simple beginnings as a single cell to a rather fancy organism like a human being. The genome of an organism is its entire set of DNA instructions. The human genome adds up to 3.1 billion of those letters. And that is a phenomenal thing to think about. If we decided we were going to read the human genome tonight because it would be a useful thing to admire, we would probably regret it after we got started if we'd made a real commitment to do that, because we would be here reading at an average pace of A, C, G, T, T, and so on, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day for 31 years. And we have that information now, which is a pretty amazing thing to say, and you have it. Even before we knew its sequence, you had it already, and it's inside each cell of your body. And every time the cell divides, you've got to copy the whole thing. And occasionally mistakes get made, and if they get made during your life, well, they may not cause much trouble, but if they happen to get made in a particularly vulnerable place, they might start you on a path towards cancer. And if a mistake gets made in passing the DNA from parent to child, well, then that child might end up with some kind of a birth defect. But once in a very long time, that change might actually be beneficial. And that, of course, is how evolution works, with gradual change applied to this DNA sequence over long periods of time, resulting in what Darwin put forward by the means of natural selection, a gradual evolution and the introduction of new species. So DNA is, if you're a biologist, kind of the center here in terms of trying to understand how the whole system works. The Human Genome Project was proposed rather controversially in the late 1980s, and most of the scientific community was deeply skeptical about whether this was a good idea or not. It might cost too much money. It might not be feasible. It might just attract mediocre scientists because it seemed kind of boring. Well, none of those things turned out to be true. It certainly wasn't boring. And I'm happy to report that, in fact, it went better than expected. And for me, as the person who had the privilege of serving as the project manager of this enterprise, to be able to announce not just a draft, which we had in June of 2000, but a finished human genome in April 2003, exactly to the month, 50 years after Watson and Crick described the double helix, and completing all of the goals of the Genome Project more than 2 years ahead of schedule and more than $400 million under budget, doggone it, which doesn't happen very often. And so, 2 years after I began this journey on a hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains up in Oregon, with my mind cleared of those distractions that so often get in the way of realizing what is really true and important, I felt I had reached the point where I no longer had reasons to resist, and I didn't want to resist. I had a hunger to give in to this. And so that day, I became a Christian. That was 31 years ago. And I was scared, and I was afraid I was going to turn into somebody very somber and lose my sense of humor and probably be called to Africa the next week or something. But instead, I discovered this great sense of peace and a joyfulness about having finally crossed that bridge. And also to have done so in a fashion that seemed to live up to my hopes that faith would not be something you had to plunge into blindly, but something where there was, in fact, reason behind the decision. And I guess I should have known, because as I began to learn a bit more about the Bible, I encountered this verse in Matthew where Jesus is being questioned about which is the greatest commandment in the law. The Pharisees here trying to trap Jesus into saying something they can point out as being inconsistent with the Old Testament. And Jesus replies, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Wow, there it was, all your mind. We're supposed to use our minds when it comes to faith. Mark Knoll has written a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind to suggest that perhaps we haven't done such a good job of that. And here it was. That's part of the commandments. Love the Lord with all your mind. Well, okay, this was an exciting time, but I was already a scientist, and I was already interested in genetics. So as I began to tell all these people that I knew of this good news, they said, doesn't your head explode? You're in trouble, boy. You're headed for a collision. These worldviews are not going to get along. And especially, isn't evolution incompatible with faith? What are you going to do about that? So I had a lot of those conversations. In fact, I've continued to have those over the course of quite a few years. There was one in particular that left an indelible mark on me, and I thought just for fun, I would share it with you, because the inquisitor in this case is somebody you might recognize, somebody with a rather quick intellect and a sharp way of trying to convey his point. And if you stay up late at night, you might have actually seen him before, because he tends to come on, I don't know what time zone we're in here, but he comes on pretty late, and it's Stephen Colbert. Well, that was a white-knuckled experience. I thought when I went to be on Colbert that we'd have a chance to talk about the plan before we're suddenly in front of millions of people, but that's not how it goes. I was there in the green room waiting for him to turn up. The clock's ticking. It's 5 minutes before showtime. He finally pops in and says, "Oh, you're Collins. I'm going to get you. You're going to go down." So that was the pre-interview. And so, okay, Stephen, what really is your problem here? Let's talk about this. If evolution is such a stumbling block in this science-faith conversation, we better ask the question whether it is well-founded or not. And certainly there are people saying evolution is on its last legs. Evolution is known by scientists to have many flaws, but nobody wants to admit it. What is the actual facts of the matter? Well, I can tell you from my perspective as somebody who studies DNA, that DNA has become probably the strongest window into this question that we could imagine. Darwin could not possibly have imagined a better means of testing his theory, except maybe for a time machine, because along comes DNA with its digital code, and it provides us insights that are really quite phenomenal. And in fact, the bottom line is that DNA tells us that Darwin's theory was fundamentally right on target. We have not worked out some of the mathematical details of some of this, but I think it's fair to say that here in 2009, serious biologists almost universally see evolution as so fundamental that you can't really think about life sciences without it at the core. So what's some of the evidence to support what I just said? Well, looking at the fossil record is one thing. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about DNA because I think it gives us more detailed information, but the fossil record is entirely consistent with what I'm going to say. We have, after all, compared now the genomes of multiple organisms. We not only sequenced the human genome, but the mouse, the chimpanzee, the dog, the honeybee, the sea urchin, the macaque, Good heavens, the platypus. And those are just the ones that made the cover of Nature or Science. There's now about 30 more. And when you put the DNA sequences into a computer and ask the computer to make sense out of it, the computer doesn't know what any of these organisms look like, nor does it know about the fossil record. And the computer comes up with this diagram, which is a tree, an evolutionary tree, consistent entirely with descent from a common ancestor, a tree that includes humans as part of this enterprise, and which agrees in detail with trees that people have previously put together based upon anatomy or the fossil record. Now, you could argue, and people certainly have, that doesn't prove that common ancestry is right. If all those organisms instead were created by God as individual acts of special creation, it's entirely plausible that God might use some of the same motifs in generating those organisms' genomes, and so the ones that looked most alike would have genomes that were most alike for functional reasons. And I could not refute that on the basis of this particular diagram. But let's look a little deeper. Let's look into the details of genes and also something called pseudogenes. And let me explain a particularly interesting feature of one little snippet of DNA as an example of this. So first of all, we're looking here at 3 genes that happen to be in the same order in humans, cows, mice, and quite a lot of other mammals as well. EPHX2, GULO, and CLU are in that same order for these 3 species, which in itself is at least suggestive of a common ancestor. Otherwise, why would these genes be clumped together this way? They are totally different in their functions. There doesn't seem to be any logical reason why they need to be near each other, but they are. But I chose this particular set of genes for a reason, because they tell a very interesting story. Because for the cow and the mouse, all 3 of those genes are functional. For the human, the one in the middle, GULO, when you look at its DNA sequence, it is really messed up. In fact, it is what we would call a pseudogene. About half of its coding region has been deleted. It's just not there. It cannot make a protein. It can't do much of anything except travel along from generation to generation as a little DNA fossil of what used to be there. Now, is there a consequence of this? By the way, this is a downgrade, not an upgrade. Most of our genes are not like this, but this one tells a particularly interesting story. So GULO stands for galunolactone oxidase. What in the world is that? Well, that's the enzyme which is the final step in the synthesis of ascorbic acid, or vitamin C. And so it is because of that pseudogene, that deletion of GULO, that those sailors got scurvy, but the mice on the ship didn't. Because this is, for us as humans, one of those things that apparently we got along fine without, except in unusual circumstances. A mutation arose, there was no evolutionary drive to get rid of it, and so it is one we now have. We humans are altogether completely deficient in being able to make vitamin C, whereas other animals are not. Now, look at that picture and try to contemplate how that could have come about in the absence of a common ancestor. If you're going to argue that these are individual acts of special creation, then you would have to say that God intentionally placed a defective gene in the very spot where common ancestry would have predicted it to be. And God would have to do that, presumably, to test our faith. But that sounds like a God that I don't recognize. That sounds like a God who's involved in deception and not in truth. I could give you many more examples like this. But when you look at the details, it seems inescapable that evolution is correct and that we humans are part of that. Well, if that's true, does that leave any room for God? There are certainly those who are using evolution as a club over the head of believers. Richard Dawkins perhaps being the most visible, and this book has sold millions of copies. One of those rare books that does not need a subtitle to tell you what it's about. And Dawkins, who is an incredibly gifted writer and articulator of evolutionary theory for the general public, has shifted by the publication of this book into a very different space, where he has become really, in a very antagonistic way, a critic of religion, not only claiming that it is unnecessary and ill-informed, but that it is evil, and that religion is basically responsible for most of the bad things in the world. Dawkins uses science as a core of his argument trying to demonstrate that in the absence of scientific proof of God's existence, the default answer should be that there is no God. But of course, there's a problem here. One of the problems is, as Chesterton points out, the assertion of a universal negative, which is a daring dogma indeed. The other problem is a category error. If God has any significance in most religions, God has to be at least in part outside of nature, not bound by nature. Pantheists might be an exception, but most other religions would certainly agree that God is not limited, therefore, by nature itself. Science is. Science really is only legitimately able to comment on things that are part of nature, and science is really good at that. But if you're going to try to take the tools of science and disprove God, you're in the wrong territory. Science has to remain silent on the question of anything that falls outside of the natural world. Dawkins and I had a debate about this in Time magazine, which is still up on the web if you want to go and look at it, and basically went back and forth about a number of the issues. But this was an interesting part because I really challenged him about how it was possible from a scientific perspective to rule out categorically the presence of God. And if you read the interview at the end, he does say, well, he couldn't, on a purely rational basis, exclude the possibility of a supernatural being, but it would be so much grander and more complicated and awesome than anything humans could contemplate that it surely must not be the God we were all talking about. And I wanted to, jump up and shout, hallelujah, we have a convert, but I didn't. But it does reveal something that I think is important to notice, and that is that oftentimes when people are trying to disprove or to throw stones at belief, they caricature belief in a way that makes it very narrow and small-minded. And the sort of thing that a mature believer wouldn't recognize is the thing that is being torn apart. And of course, that's the old trick of a debater. You mischaracterize your opponent's position, and then you dismantle it, and your opponent is left wondering, well, wait a minute, what happened there? I think that has very much been the case with the books by Hitchens and Harris and Dennett and by Dawkins himself, The Four Horsemen of the Atheist Apocalypse. So again, I would submit that if you want to be an atheist, you cannot claim that reason completely supports your position, because if the reason you are basing this upon is of science, it will fall short of being able to comment about God's existence. So what then? How can evolution and faith be reconciled? Have I led us into a dilemma here by talking about my own faith conversion and then telling you that I think evolution is true? Well, actually, no. 40% of scientists are believers in a personal God. Most of them, from my experience, have arrived at the same way of putting this together, a way that is actually pretty simple and almost obvious, but it's amazing how little it gets talked about. And it goes like this. Almighty God, who is not limited in space or time, created our universe 13.7 billion years ago with that fine-tuning, the parameters precisely set to allow the development of complexity over long periods of time, all very intentional. God's plan included the mechanism of evolution. That was the way in which the marvelous diversity of living things on our planet was to come to be. And most especially, that plan included us, human beings. After evolution in the fullness of time, which is a long time for us, but maybe a blink of the eye for God, had prepared a sufficiently advanced neurological house, the brain, which would be pretty necessary for what's to come here, God then gifted humanity with free will and with a soul. Thus, humans at that point received this special status, which in biblical terms is made in God's image, but I don't think God is a kindly gentleman with a flowing white beard in the sky. I think made in God's image is about mind and not about body. We humans, having been given those gifts, and here you'll recognize the story of the Garden of Eden, used our free will to disobey God, leading to our realization of being in violation of the moral law, and thus we were estranged from God. For Christians, as I learned, as I was trying to figure this all out, Jesus is the solution to that estrangement. That's it. A very simple, but I think entirely compatible view that does no violence either to faith or to science, and puts them in a harmonious position that both explains the way in which origins can be thought about and puts us in a position to be able to further explore the consequences. Now, this is often called theistic evolution. It's not a term that many people are all that comfortable with, including me. Evolution is the noun, theistic is the adjective. Sort of sounds like you're tipping the balance there in the favor of the scientific view, and a lot of people aren't quite sure what theistic means anyway, so maybe we need a better term. One possibility is to think about what this means. Well, it means life, bios, by God speaking us into being, the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, the first chapter of John. Life through the Word, bios through logos, or just simply BioLogos. And that is perhaps a useful alternative instead of theistic evolution. And in that regard, as the title of my book indicates, then maybe we could think about this universal code of life, the DNA molecule, as the language of God.